Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to do something a little bit different today because for a while I've been wanting to make a video about films that I think are underrated or underappreciated. I didn't want to title this 10 underrated films though because I think the word underrated is very open to interpretation. Look, some of the movies on this list will probably have fan bases either because it's an old movie and it just doesn't get talked about as much anymore as it used to, or some other irrelevant reason, so I decided to title it 10 Awesome Movies That No One Talks About. Just to be clear, I didn't cherry pick these from any particular time period, nor did I try to choose certain genres. They're just 10 movies that came to mind when I was thinking of things that I really like and no one really talks about. Before I get into the list, here are a couple of honorable mentions. Layer Cake. Daniel Craig is channeling his inner James Bond before he even got cast in the role. Collateral. I know Michael Mann got a lot of praise for Heat, but no one talks about this thriller in which Tom Cruise plays a hitman. Very entertaining, fun ride. And lastly, Nightcrawler. Jake Gyllenhaal plays an absolute garbage human being, and it sheds some light on how fucked up journalism can be. Moving into the core list now, number 10 is Fright Knight, directed by Tom Holland. Not Spider-Man, this is a different Tom Holland. As far as vampire movies go, we hear a lot about The Lost Boys, Bram Stoker's Dracula, From Dusk Till Dawn, unfortunately Twilight. Rarely do I hear people mention Fright Night. It's about a teenager who learns that his neighbor is a vampire. Very simple premise, but man, this one is so cool. It's got marvelous creature effects. These are not your traditional vampires. It does have some more grotesque imagery when you get into the third act. It's also part horror, part comedy. I think horror comedies are very underrated in general, so it's nice to see one from the 80s. There are a couple of very memorable performances, particularly Chris Sarandon as the main vampire, and Roddy McDowall is awesome as well. Number 9 is Under the Silver Lake, directed by David Robert Mitchell, who I know from directing It Follows, a magnificent low-budget horror film. Andrew Garfield stars as Sam, who meets and becomes a bit obsessed with a girl in his apartment complex. She suddenly vanishes, which leads him on a complicated investigation throughout Los Angeles as he searches for her. Soon he starts to believe that he's seeing hidden messages everywhere and that those messages suggest a greater conspiracy is at work. This is the type of movie that is open to interpretation. You can watch the entire thing and have a completely different idea of what it all means compared to someone else, and I know that's a big turnoff to a lot of people, so know yourself. If you don't like those kinds of films, this probably won't win you over, but it's got a pretty weak critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, which surprised me. I think it's well executed as far as these types of movies go. I'm always down for a good surreal fever dream type mystery, and this does satisfy the desire for that. Number 8 is Bone Tomahawk, easily one of the most messed up, disturbing horror films, and nobody ever talks about how disturbing this is because I think a lot of people just haven't seen it. An Old West sheriff played by Kurt Russell is dispatched to rescue members of a small town from cannibalistic cave dwellers who took them and ravaged the town. First of all, excellent cast here. Richard Jenkins, Patrick Wilson, a couple of other supporting members that left a very good impression. The suspense in this movie is excellent as these guys try desperately to win a fight that they clearly weren't prepared for. This gets really brutal at times. In fact, I would say it has 2 separate scenes that literally made my jaw drop. As someone who watches a lot of horror and can usually stomach some pretty disturbing stuff, it takes a lot for me to get to that point. And it never really felt gratuitous. It made sense given the context of what they're dealing with here. Number 7, The Last Duel. I know a lot of people roll their eyes when they hear Ridley Scott's name nowadays because he has fallen off the wagon a little bit. This is a war film set in the 1300s. It does contain some heavy subject matter, so if you're triggered by that, maybe sit this one out. 2 knights go head to head when one of them, played by Adam Driver, sexually assaults the wife of another, who's played by Matt Damon. This film contains one of the most overlooked performances ever, that being one by Jodie Comer. It is violent, it's epic, and visually astounding like all of Ridley Scott's films, but it also has a lot to say about the time period, how women were treated during this time, and even when they were listened to, in the end it turns out to not really be about them. When she does come forward, it's left up to Jodie Comer's husband to settle something that happened to her, which ultimately leaves her feeling a bit voiceless. I'm pretty sure this got a good critic score, but it flopped big time and did not deserve to. Number 6, Last Night in Soho. I'm a big Edgar Wright fan. I have no idea why this wasn't received as well as some of his other great films like Baby Driver, Shaun of the Dead, and Hot Fuzz. What this film is about, in essence, at least from my interpretation, is how dangerous it is to idealize our hopes and dreams when reality often turns out to be not so pristine. We have a main character here who dreams of London in the 1960s, a time period that, mind you, she wasn't even alive during. In these dreams, she begins to mirror the life of another girl, which kickstarts the film's eerie mystery. I absolutely love surreal fever dream type stories. This film also contains a lot of bright neon lighting. Kind of reminds me of something Dario Argento would make if he was still in his prime. The ending is a bit weak and abrupt, so I can kind of see how people would fall off with this one, but I love everything about the journey that leads to that ending so much. Number 5 is The Edge of 17, perhaps one of the most underrated coming-of-age stories I've ever seen. This film was very well received critically, but I was shocked to learn how little attention it got from award shows. I think it was nominated for 1 Golden Globe, but no original screenplay nod for first-time director/screenwriter Kelly Freeman Craig. Haley Steinfeld got put on the map with True Grit back in 2010, but I think she's every bit as great here as a high schooler going through tough times. She gets betrayed by one of her closest friends and only friends, probably some depression involved there. Extremely well fleshed out main character who is both likable and relatable. I also have to praise Woody Harrelson as one of the teachers. He's a no BS kind of guy who shoots straight and doesn't sugarcoat things, but even he becomes pretty endearing by the end of this film. It's about overcoming your own inhibitions, mending relationships, etc., etc. All of these are familiar themes, but the execution and the dialogue is pretty much flawless. Number 4 is Possession from 1981. This is perhaps the least known film on the list. It's directed by a Polish filmmaker whose name is currently escaping me. This film follows a married couple played by Sam Neill and Isabella Adjani, who share a son, and it's essentially 2 hours of watching this relationship crumble in the worst way possible. It's disturbing and uses a lot of horrific elements as metaphors for the emotions and desires of the characters. Without spoiling things, there are some gnarly creature effects as it moves more into the horror territory. And man, this movie features an iconic performance by Isabella Adjani that deserves more recognition. This movie is unhinged in the best way possible. I can't believe I'd never heard of it. I think it's got like 30 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes total. So clearly, at least in terms of the professional film community, not many people have seen it. Number 3 is The Rock, directed by Michael Bay. I think this one was actually pretty popular back in '96 when it first released, but nowadays people hear Michael Bay's name and immediately assume the worst because of the abysmal Transformers sequels that he started making and a lot of the other cinematic junk food that he's resorted to. This, on the other hand, is a good old-fashioned 90s action flick that just gets your adrenaline pumping and keeps it that way. I just rewatched it a few days ago, and honestly, I could sit down right now and watch it again and probably be just as entertained. It's about a disgruntled war veteran played by Ed Harris who takes a bunch of tourists as hostages on Alcatraz Island along with some weapons of mass destruction, and he does this because he's pissed off by how the government has treated the families of fallen soldiers. Pretty complex villain for a Michael Bay film. Granted, it doesn't justify the things that he does, but you at least understand them. Nick Cage and Sean Connery are sent to infiltrate and stop them since Connery's character once escaped Alcatraz. What a wild premise. This one's just an all-around banger. I love Hans Zimmer's score. It got stuck in my head as soon as I watched this a few days ago. This is one that I was a little hesitant to put on the list because I feel like a lot of people actually have seen this and really like it, but I don't care. I'm throwing it on here anyway. Number 2 is Wind River, another very well-received film critically, but I had never heard of it until I just saw it on one of the streaming services and decided to give it a watch a couple years ago. To give a brief synopsis, the body of a young Native American woman is found on a remote Indian reservation. In response, the FBI sends in a grand total of 1 inexperienced agent to investigate the potential homicide, played by Elizabeth Olsen, and she teams up with a wildlife officer played by Jeremy Renner. This movie gets very dark at times, and it does have the standard thriller feel to it in terms of how it's directed and the general storytelling timeline, but I have to say that it does contain one of the most suspenseful standoffs I have ever seen. From the beginning of this sequence, you know something's up, but the film holds that tension until it reaches its boiling point. I also like that it follows flawed characters who actually need to rely on others for help sometimes, and they do experience some growth as it goes on. But perhaps most importantly, it sheds light on the violence against Native American women and the level of priority that these situations are attributed. And number 1 is Bad Times at the El Royale. I've been wanting to talk about this movie for a while, and I'm glad I finally found the context to do so. Generally, I think critics liked this, but nobody went out to see it. I've been a fan of Drew Goddard since Cabin in the Woods back in 2011. I think a lot of people have seen that, otherwise I'd put it on this list because it's one of the most wildly original horror comedies that I've ever seen. This is his sophomore piece, and it's a very different film. I see a lot of Tarantino comparisons, and it is similar to something like The Hateful Eight, but why is that considered a bad thing? Did Tarantino put a trademark on his style of filmmaking? It has a pretty excellent setup. A bunch of mysterious characters arrive at a rundown hotel that marks the border between California and Nevada. Immediately it establishes that we shouldn't trust any of these characters or who they say they are, because everyone has an ulterior motive or something that they're hiding. These secrets reveal themselves over the course of the movie as paths cross and blood inevitably gets spilled. I love a good mystery, and this kept me intrigued throughout. The cast is awesome. We've got Jeff Bridges, Cynthia Erivo, John Hamm, Dakota Johnson, Lewis Pullman, Kaylee Spaney, the list goes on and on. Chris Hemsworth gives what is perhaps my favorite performance of his as a deranged Jim Jones-esque cult leader. It runs a bit on the longer side, but I'll be honest, I was never bored during it. So that's it. Those are my 10 films that are very underrated and you should absolutely check out if they sound like they're up your alley. I mean, once again, you know your tastes better than anyone else, but if any of these sound interesting, give them a watch. I think they're very underappreciated. I'm always looking to check out new movies, so if you guys have any underrated suggestions, drop down into the comments and let me know. Hit that like button and subscribe while you're at it if you want to see more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.